Hi. I'm going to talk about one building, so hopefully I will be 25 minutes, but... Oh, there's a timer, okay. But it is a very big building. In fact, I think it might be one of the biggest... I think it's the biggest listed building in Europe, and it's Park Hill Flats. It's a building with a lot of stories about it. There's actually a West End musical opening in February, telling some of the stories about the lives that have been lived in this. So it's a building, when you go around, it's almost impossible not to feel that history of lives lived there. It's the first phase of 4 projects that Sheffield City Council built. It's funny, Julian, talk about how long it takes to build things. This took 2 years to build. And then Sheffield City Council, it's 1,000 flats. Then they went on to build 4 more projects of all about 1,000 flats within 10 years. So they built 4,000 homes in a decade. So Park Hill was the first, and they're all slightly different, although they're based on the same typology. So Park Hill has a flat roof and a ground floor that steps with the landscape. It's built on a hill. And these kind of courtyards are different. The height of them relates to the scale of the space they embrace. Beyond that, there's not much logic about this building, and we have tried to find a logic when we've been dealing with it, and I find it fascinating that it got built. And there's no ground floor plan. The way we've had to draw this building has been completely different from any other building. We've had to have a special language about how we talk about the flats. We can't talk about the ground floor. So that there's almost a separate team in the office that has this strange language to describe this building, and the way we've had to draw it for site has been completely different from any other project, which is probably why we've been given phases 4 and 5, because I think Urban Special probably had enough of reinvention of this building. So this is phase 2. It was finished a year ago, and it's just that red bit is 200 flats and 2,500 square metres commercial space. It's really hard to gauge the scale of this building unless you visit it. Then they built Hyde Park Flats. 2 years later, they built this. It's even bigger. This was the second to be demolished. A bit of it's been retained. It's a shame. It's quite a cool building. But then they built Kelvin Flats, and then finally, and I've only recently found out about this one, Broome Hall, which was the last to be built and the first to be demolished. And it was made out of concrete rather than being concrete frame with brick infill, and it had problems from the beginning of damp and infestation. And yeah, but still, for anyone doing housing, it's pretty phenomenal achievement for the council. And they were all built, designed around this idea of streets in the sky, 10 years before the ones we see in London. And Park Hill was the first one to be built with this idea, which is you take the streets up, and there's a street every 3rd floor, and you either go into your flat and up, or down into your flat. So hence we talk about it as below street flats and above street flats when we're trying to describe the flats. The street then was thought of as a place to get your milk delivered. They had a specially made milk cart that used to trundle along, and all the streets eventually hit the ground. So you can, it made it, to be honest, when it went bad, which it did in the kind of late 70s and 80s, it was perfect for escaping from any kind of police. And I don't know, I haven't really got time to go into the story of its downfall particularly, but it had a terrible reputation when I became a student in the late 80s in Sheffield. It was just notorious. But, the first 20 years went pretty well for Park Hill. It was built as a kind of citadel. It had everything on it. It had playgrounds, pubs, shops, schools. It was quite isolated from Sheffield, and it was very successful initially. But as I said, the decline came, and it would have been demolished with the others unless there was a valiant effort by one woman in the council called Pat Midgley, who now has a road named after her. And she single-handedly saved it. And I remember when it was saved, and I thought, I was so pleased because it was such a building. I think being a student in Sheffield, you were taught to love it. It was almost like you were brainwashed into think it was amazing, but also because it was considered such a failure, there was a contradiction around architects and could they do housing. So when it was saved, I just remember thinking, oh my God, who's going to take that on? But Urban Splash did. I don't know if they regret it, because that's another story in itself. The phase one, which stopped in the middle of site. There's a great programme on English heritage, which I've watched a couple of times now when it stops in the middle of the making of the programme. And phase one was by Hawkins, Brown and Eggeritt West, and it reinvented the building. It needed a complete change because it was loathed, I think, in Sheffield. So they stripped it back to the concrete frame and then infilled it, and it did reinvent it as this kind of new, shiny building. And it was really very successful. And I think that went a whole heap, did a massive thing for when it came to phase two. That work had actually been done, and it had people, admittedly early adopters had moved in, businesses had moved in. It took quite a while, but it had started to become a successful place. And when they were looking at phase two, which is kind of connected via a famous bridge, which has some famous graffiti on, which again has a radio program about where this graffiti came from, which I won't go into. That phase two was connected via the bridges, and the brief for the competition they ran was to consider making a lighter touch building to try and keep more of the existing fabric of the building. And they did, Urban Splash did this really interesting thing. They gave, I think there were 6 shortlisted practices, and they gave everyone a flat. They were in a right state. And they gave us 2 weeks, and the interview was to invite the jury into your flat and show them what you'd done to the flat, which was kind of wonderfully open-ended. And actually, this is the most fun I've ever had doing a competition. But we were left to wander around the building for 2 weeks. Well, not that long. We kind of wandered around thinking, oh my God. But observations were the bricks were great. We couldn't see any cracking. How it has stayed like this, given what's happened to the concrete and the fact there are barely any wall ties, is probably because they're bedded in lime mortar and the mortar's allowed it to move. But the bricks were in great condition. And I'd always loved the bricks as a student because it was this handmade element in this real kind of big machine of a building. And I was like, I really wanted to keep the bricks. Actually, this proved quite a controversial decision, and no one ever liked the bricks, and we had quite a big job persuading people to keep them. The bricks were great. And the other thing, as we wandered around, we noticed it was hard not to notice the traces of the lives that had been lived there, what people had done to their flats to make them into a home. And a lot of people had painted their balconies. And we don't know why. We mused, maybe they just didn't like looking at the brick, or maybe they wanted to point out their balcony when they're outside and say, that's my house up there, I don't know. But the flat we were given, someone had painted it white and then really carefully painted all the mortar joints in. So this was obviously a thing. And looking back at the kind of criticisms of the building when it was first built, this is part of our submission. Lots of criticisms was that the ideas of taking these streets up into the sky and keeping neighbours, that the individuality of the homes was lost within the whole. And perhaps maybe it was about giving the homes an identity rather than just not liking the brick. So in these 2 weeks, we kind of came up with this idea that we would insulate and colour the reveals of the building, which is different from phase one. They had it on the on the face. We were doing the reveals because actually it solved a lot of the cold bridging issues with the concrete frame going back into the building. And it looks really like this, which is amazing. Maybe we should do everything in 2 weeks rather than labour over it. And this is one of the few surviving architect's drawings. We were given this as part of the competition brief. And we didn't have long, so we were like, oh, well, we need to solve the pink flat. The pink flat was a 1-bed flat with a kitchen. It was a studio, I guess, but really, really poor. And the above street flats were good. They were you could knock the living rooms open to make that double space that is what phase one has, and we felt we'd leave them alone and we'd solve the below street flat. And we did a, I'm not even going to show the proposal, because I think when we came up with a solution for this, and we thought, well, this is going to be a cluster of flats that repeats around the building, because that's what you would do now. And then when we actually, post-competition, and obviously, you know, when we'd done our fee proposal, we found out that not only were there 2 pink flats, but they were just randomly distributed across the building, which is what makes this building like a massive 3D jigsaw puzzle. And there's no cluster of flats. Every flank is different. And what turned into a solution for 4 flat types then became a solution for 37 different flats. We created this problem because we were trying to retain the existing fabric. We were trying to keep the party walls and upgrade them. So phase 1 didn't have this problem, and we suddenly ended up with this, this issue really. But I suppose we were really trying to reduce carbon footprint. For the competition itself, we decided we were going to just spray paint our flat, and you know, it has a massive history of graffiti, Park Hill, so we thought this was an obvious thing to do. And we did this kind of frieze, which is about the building, inspired by the quote from Grenville Squires, who was the caretaker, who's actually got lots of amazing quotes. But we did think she just wants to wash her face and put on a new frock. You know, that we didn't need to do that much to the building. So the idea is from the front, it's like a cleaned up version of Park Hill, and as you turn the corner, you start to see the individual dwellings within the whole. And the other thing we did is we did the scenes from the below street, which was the thing we tried to solve, and we kind of did them as friezes. And I genuinely think that this was what won us the competition, when we got everyone in bed together and we made the jury laugh, because actually between us no one had come up with anything particularly innovative to do with the building, because it's such a specific building. This is the other architect's drawing we were given, and I think really this just highlights, it is one big cold bridge. It's an exposed concrete frame. It's listed, so you can't do anything with that. And it's very low floor-to-floor heights. It's 2515 floor-to-floor, and normally in a new building you'd have 3.1 metres. Very little to play with. The floor slabs are very thin. They're 125 thick floor slabs. The roof is 100. And you know, this has been built so sparingly. It's kind of unbelievable, and in a way that probably is why there's lots of spalling on the concrete, because the reinforcement bars are so close to the surface. There's had to be a massive kind of work structurally. This is why it's so amazing the bricks are still there. You know, there had been a lot of work to try and repair it. And also you have to be really careful with, obviously, with loads on these floors. And the corridors are really low ceilinged. I mean, it's a shame there's not a person in this one, but so yeah, big acoustic problems with people walking across the street, very little space for insulation. I always just thought if they could just done it 1 brick higher, we could have done so much more with it. And you know, but actually, I think this is it. Yeah, this is how it was. I mean, it was a really successful and loved place, and actually even people who lived here in the bad days loved living here. And what we noticed from these old photos, the other thing people did as they moved in was they put some lino on their doorstep, and it was a little doorstep. It was precast concrete, and they covered them. And when we went back, we found they're all still there. So we felt that this was these two moments, the kind of expression of the people who lived there, the balconies and the doormats, were really important. And you know, we did a lino survey, and we came up with some. We took the patterns, and we wanted to give everyone a bit more space on their threshold. And also we had to come up with an acoustic floor that didn't transfer sound because we had so little to play with. So I think that with a combination of things, we proposed a kind of resin bonded gravel with a rubber recycled tyre kind of rubber underneath to try and solve the acoustic problems. And we've cast these doormats into them. And another thing we had tried to do was to put more passive surveillance onto the street. It was a real problem that was even admitted by the architects that was, when you walked along the streets, they were completely anonymous. You didn't know who was in or out. So it's been quite difficult with the structure, but we managed to kind of sneak these little windows in and put these glass shelves in, which we hung on to through value engineering. It was inspired by phase one that had these corner windows where residents would put things, and one of the streets had a Christmas competition who had the best window, and I was saying I'm sure they're going to do the same in phase two, and actually I'm just really delighted that practically everyone has displayed something in them. So technically, what have we done? We've added very, very small bits of insulation everywhere in the ceilings, in the floors. We've worked with a specialist consultant who we've changed the specification of the insulation as it goes away from the concrete frame. So there's a higher spec near the window, and then it gets less and less and less. There's very little. One of the things that was really disappointing was I don't know if you can see it there. No, that's too small. There is a beam which in phase one looks amazing. It comes from front to back, and it's a concrete beam within the room, and it looks amazing. And we have had to clad it because it was one of the major problems of bringing cold into the room, and that was gutting. And also that in that particular instant, it has reduced the ceiling height to 2.2, which is just feels a bit low. But I mean, I find it really interesting, how far do you go with this? And having it thermally modelled and someone like properly interrogating it, you have to take notice of it, and maybe you do things that you wouldn't normally do. The front doors are different colours, and the balcony reveals are different colours. And this debate has been running for 5 years. What colour are they going to be? And initially, when we did the competition, I said, look, they can be any colour. Park Hill's big, it can take it. It doesn't really matter. And everyone can choose their own colour, which is very impractical, but also Historic England weren't having any of it. They've had a big role in the colour debate. So we built this working model, and we've just changed the colours, took them to meetings with Historic England. They had a very specific idea, which was completely different to what we wanted to do, and we won in the end. But we had to do things like, when you have an existing building, you can try things out. So we would try out different colours, and then we had a meeting with Historic England. We'd all traipse around to have a look at them, and then they always looked terrible. And then we go back to the drawing board, and I think in the end, what happened really was this was paint on a rendered insulated reveal, and that's all the budget would allow for. But when it came to post-Grenfell, there was no fast certification for paint on the surface, but only because no one had done the test. We ended up having to use a through render, which is a much better quality material. Obviously, it's much more expensive, but that kind of saved it because it was just such a nicer finish. We'd been looking at paint all the time, and actually this is it has a depth, it changes depending on the light, the way the light grazes across it. And then it was so late in the day when this change happened, we just picked 12 colours and they got put on the building, and there's no more to it than that. And everyone just went, yeah, okay. I think everyone was just so exhausted by it. And one of the things we had to prove was because we were having a different approach. So Historic England were really uncomfortable with us not doing the same as phase one because it's listed as a whole building. I mean, it's the bits that are listed are the structure. The fabric isn't listed, but the structure is listed. And so they devised this thing called the squint test, which is, if you squint at it, will it look like Park Hill? So we had to do all these images and convince them by squinting at it, it still looked like the same building. And which, I don't know, it seems bizarre now because, it looks even more like the same building now, doesn't it? I mean, I don't know. But it was such a lot of work to do this. And I think in the end, we did lots of drawings showing that phase 1 looks great at 4 stories. It's got 4 different colours. When you get to the 4-story, but at the end, it's just yellow. And a lot of it would just be yellow. And I didn't think it worked going up the whole thing anyway. We got there in the end, but it's quite interesting looking back at these battles that you have in a building process. But we were trying to argue the brick can hold its own. The brick, the gradation of the brick, which was worked with, it was an artist that decided on the colours of the brick, and they will hold their own against the bright aluminium panels. And one of the things we did was to detail the window reveals so that these panels of brick had the same kind of presence as the aluminium panels. So I think they do. We did other interventions like opening goods lifts to get views into the residents' gardens. I mean, this is the coloured side of it, not the street side, and you don't really notice the colours that much when you're looking at it. It's only when you look obliquely you start to see the colours. And what's interesting is I thought because of the stress around this one topic, there was, we might end up with flats we can't sell because people just don't like the colour. And actually, I went to talk to sales and no one cares. No one has chosen their flat depending on the colour. It's not a thing at all. But actually, in fact, they love the colours. So I just want, it's probably not the best way to end a lecture, is on the techie bits. But I do want to talk about embodied carbon. Because we're doing the next 2 phases, we just really needed to find out how well we'd done with this one. And so we couldn't persuade the client to do it, but so we commissioned an analysis into the embodied carbon, operational carbon and embodied carbon. And I think the client didn't want to do it because they were worried it was bad news. It would be bad news. But I think we need, as architects, we really need to find out where things are bad news, because otherwise we'll never do any better. It was good news on the operational carbon. I mean, despite the kind of limited amount of insulation we could put into the building, it did have an impact. But also, there is also the decarbonisation of the grid. So it was an 87% reduction in operational carbon. The upfront embodied carbon, which is the carbon in construction, not considering demolition after, post-use, was 61%. And we wanted to look at this in a bit more detail, really, because I was hoping it'd be better than that. It's still classed as very good. It's A+. And it still saves 310 kilograms of CO2 per metre squared against a good practice new build. But I think it is interesting when you look, so then we had we've got an elemental look at all the building materials within it. And I think this is the bit that I think coming to the next phases, we can really make a difference, because some of those elements are quite surprising in the amount of, they're very carbon intensive, and can we look for alternatives? So that's something we're looking at the moment. So I finished on the really boring bit, but.